There's a reason you feel tired, emotionally drained, even when you haven't done much. A reason why certain people seem to pull your energy like gravity, leaving you hollow. And it's not because you're weak. It's because you've been too available, too responsive, too willing to say yes when everything inside you screamed no. In this video, we're not just going to talk about boundaries, we're going to explore why your silence holds more power than any argument, and why stepping back doesn't mean you're giving up. It means you're finally reclaiming control. Drawing from Carl Jung's most profound insights on the psyche, manipulation, and individuation, we'll uncover the hidden dynamics that keep you trapped in roles you never chose. You'll begin to see why some people panic when you stop replying, and why choosing yourself feels so uncomfortable yet so necessary. By the end of this journey, you won't just understand why everything changes when you stop being available. You'll finally be ready to do it. So stay. Because your peace isn't found in being everything to everyone. It's found in learning when to disappear. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to command a room without saying a word? They don't explain. They don't justify. They don't raise their voice. They simply withdraw and everything shifts. The atmosphere changes. People who once ignored them begin to chase. Those who took them for granted suddenly feel unsettled. It's as if silence itself became a gravitational force. But here's the question no one asks. What really changed? Was it the silence, or was it the energy they stopped giving away? Most of us live in a reactive trance. Someone texts us, we reply instantly. Someone offends us, we defend ourselves. We're taught from childhood that being present, agreeable, and accessible is how we earn love. But in reality, it's how we become invisible. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a better understanding of ourselves." When you're constantly irritated, drained, or emotionally tangled, it's not just about them. It's about where you've allowed your energy to leak without noticing. And it's often through a false sense of duty. We confuse kindness with availability. We confuse love with sacrifice. And over time, we confuse our identity with our usefulness to others. You say yes to keep the peace. You reply to feel needed. You stay, even when it's suffocating. And piece by piece, you vanish. The world doesn't reward endless availability. It exploits it, because predictability becomes a tool. The more others can anticipate your response, the easier you are to manipulate. And the more you react, the more you become a puppet to every emotional tug. But the moment you stop, the moment you choose silence over explanation, distance over defense, something remarkable happens. Those around you begin to unravel. Not because you're cruel, but because your absence removes their control. They don't miss you. They miss the version of you that filled their voids. The version who said yes, even when you wanted to say no. The truth is, when you stop being emotionally available, the world doesn't fall apart. It simply reveals who was holding it together. And often, that person was you. So ask yourself honestly, who gets desperate when you go quiet? Who becomes irritable when you don't respond? And what does that tell you not just about them, but about how much of yourself you've been giving away without even realizing it? Part 2. The dark side of people pleasing. We grow up learning that to be loved is to be available. To be seen is to be helpful. To be safe is to keep others comfortable. And slowly, we begin to believe that our worth is tied to our ability to respond quickly, kindly, constantly. But here's what no one tells you. This emotional generosity, when unchecked, turns into self-erasure. It's not love you're offering. It's your boundaries. It's not presence you're giving. It's your peace. Carl Jung spoke often about the persona, the mask we wear to be accepted. And for many of us, that mask looks like the reliable one, the peacemaker, the one who never says no. But every time you say yes out of guilt, every time you smile to avoid conflict, every time you answer when you're exhausted, you reinforce a lie. A lie that says your needs don't matter as much. That your silence is rudeness. That your no is a betrayal. And the world gladly accepts this lie because it makes you predictable. It makes you usable. And in a culture obsessed with productivity and emotional convenience, your predictability becomes currency. But that currency buys you nothing of value. Not love, not respect, not peace. Instead, it buys you exhaustion, frustration, and an identity built on pleasing others at the cost of yourself. You start saying, "I'm fine," when you're breaking. You go to events you dread, respond to messages you wish you could ignore, stay in relationships that feel like slow suffocation, all because you fear being seen as difficult, selfish, or cold. But ask yourself how much of your life is shaped by what you're afraid of being called, rather than who you truly are? Western culture, especially in relationships and workplace dynamics, reinforces this myth of eternal accessibility. You're praised for overcommitting, for sacrificing rest, for showing up no matter the cost. But is that really strength, or is it the slow death of the self? True kindness does not require you to be endlessly available. True compassion includes compassion for yourself. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for both you and them is to step back, to not answer, to say, "Not today." So next time you feel the pressure to please, pause. Not everything that asks for your attention deserves your presence. And not every relationship is worth the version of you that constantly betrays your own needs. Are you choosing connection or simply avoiding rejection? Part 3. Psychic Drain and the Energy Economy. Carl Jung never saw the mind as just a container for thoughts. He saw it as a dynamic energy system, where every emotion, every decision, every reaction costs something. Psychic energy, he believed, is finite. Not because you're weak, but because being alive is energetically expensive. And yet, most people spend this energy with no awareness of where it's going. You lose it defending yourself against petty criticisms. You waste it trying to prove your worth to people who already doubt it. You deplete it by constantly explaining your choices, justifying your boundaries, or maintaining relationships built entirely on emotional labor. But here's the truth: you're not tired because you're doing too much. You're tired because you're giving too much of yourself to things that don't give back. And more importantly, to people who never asked you to be whole, only useful. Jung warned us, that which we resist persists. So the more you fight for acceptance, the more you feed the cycle of rejection. The more you explain yourself, the more misunderstood you feel. Emotional exhaustion is not a failure of strength. It's a sign of misdirected effort. A sign that you're pouring your essence into conversations, battles, and dynamics that starve you instead of feeding you. Think of your energy as a sacred fire. If you leave it open to the wind, to anyone passing by, it will flicker and die. But if you tend it with intention, with boundaries, silence, and selective presence, it becomes a source of warmth, vision, power. This isn't about cutting everyone off. It's about becoming conscious of where your energy leaks. Who drains you with their chaos? What situations make you lose your center? And why do you keep returning to them, even when they leave you hollow? Western culture glamorizes the burnout, the overachiever, the martyr. But Jung's psychology asks something radical. What if true strength is not in endless giving, but in wise containment? What if maturity is the ability to say, "I won't waste myself on this"? When you stop reacting, when you stop volunteering your energy out of habit, the world might call you cold. But they called you warm when you were burning alive. Choose which narrative you want to live in. Because your energy, your psychic force, is not infinite. And every time you give it away carelessly, you move further from the person you're meant to become. So ask yourself, where is your energy going, and is it worth the cost? Part 4. Silent manipulation and emotional triggers. Manipulation doesn't always arrive with raised voices or obvious threats. More often, it arrives in quiet expectations, in the silent demand that you respond, that you fix, that you feel what someone else doesn't want to face. And the more emotionally available you are, the easier it is for others to turn you into their outlet, their therapist, their emotional crutch. Carl Jung called this projection the unconscious act of casting our own unresolved inner world onto others. But what's rarely discussed is the other side of this exchange. While others project, you become the receptacle. You become the canvas for their pain, their shame, their their fears. And if you've been conditioned to respond, to help, to soothe, you'll play the part without realizing the cost. You think you're being compassionate, but sometimes what looks like compassion is actually self-erasure in disguise. Think of the friend who only calls in crisis, the partner who spirals unless you intervene, the coworker who dumps their problems on you daily but never asks how you are. None of this is accidental. They're not relating to yourself, they're relating to the emotional role you've agreed to play. And why do you agree? Because somewhere inside, you're afraid. Afraid of being seen as selfish. Afraid of letting someone down. Afraid that if you're not constantly useful, you'll be abandoned. But Jung warned, the psyche knows when it's being used. And over time, your inner self begins to rebel not with loud defiance, but with fatigue, with numbness, with a quiet ache that says, "This isn't me." And here's where it gets dangerous. When you finally stop playing that role, when you pull back, go silent, or say no, the people who depended on your availability don't adapt. They attack. They accuse you of changing, of being distant, cold, arrogant. But it's not the change they fear. It's the loss of control. Because your reactions once gave them power, and now you've taken it back. Western society rarely teaches us to recognize these subtle dynamics. Instead, it teaches us to apologize for changing, to feel guilty for withdrawing, to explain our silence as if absence itself were a crime. But maybe your silence isn't an offense. Maybe it's a boundary long overdue. So now the real question is this: are you willing to sit with the discomfort of not being who they expect just so you can finally become who you are? Part 5. The break and the rise of the self. There comes a moment when something inside you breaks. Not loudly, not violently, but silently, like a thread pulled too tightly for too long. And when it snaps, there is no chaos, just clarity. A strange, unfamiliar quiet. This is the moment when you stop explaining, when you stop justifying, when the version of you that existed only to maintain peace, to hold space, to be dependable, simply vanishes. And in its place, something else begins to stir. Not anger, not bitterness, but sovereignty. Carl Jung once wrote, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The break is that darkness, the rupture of who you thought you needed to be, for others, for love, for safety. And it's terrifying because people begin to fall away, not because you've become cruel, but because you've stopped being convenient. Your silence becomes unsettling. Your distance becomes offensive. Your refusal to engage is mistaken for arrogance. But what they're truly reacting to isn't your change. It's their loss of access. The version of you that over-explained, over-apologized, over-functioned is no longer available. And now, they're left with themselves, with their own projections, their own noise, their own unmet needs. This is where many people turn back. They fear being misunderstood. They try to fix the rupture. They offer themselves again in pieces just to be accepted. But Jung's individuation process is clear. The self cannot emerge until the false self dissolves. The pain of the break is not the end. It is the beginning. Because beneath every role you played, every mask you wore, there is something ancient waiting to rise your authentic self. In Western culture, individuality is celebrated on the surface, but conformity is rewarded in practice. We're encouraged to be unique, as long as it's palatable. We're told to speak our truth, but punished when that truth disrupts someone else's comfort. And so we shrink. But the moment you stop shrinking to fit their image, the moment you let the rupture remain open, something beautiful begins. You are no longer a product of your reactions. You are no longer a mirror for someone else's shadow. You are becoming. The price? Discomfort. Distance. Being called different. The reward? Freedom. Integrity. Depth. So ask yourself now, not who will stay with me if I change, but who was really with me before I did. Part 6. The strategic power of silence. In a world addicted to noise, silence becomes a form of rebellion. It is not the absence of voice, but the presence of something deeper in tension. When you stop responding out of habit, when you stop explaining yourself out of fear, you don't disappear. You become undeniable. Because silence, when chosen with awareness, becomes a psychological mirror. Carl Jung did not romanticize stillness. He understood it as a space of alchemical transformation. In silence, you see, patterns, manipulations, emotional reflexes that once ruled your life, they surface, exposed under the light of your quiet attention. And that is why silence is feared. Not by you, but by those who relied on your reaction to maintain their own stability. They needed you to be predictable, available, emotionally involved. But when you go quiet, you take away their script. You stop playing the role they wrote for you. And suddenly, they're left with their own voice, their own motives, their own emptiness. Western culture teaches us to speak up, defend, assert. But sometimes, the most powerful assertion is the refusal to be pulled into battles that cost your peace. Not because you're weak, but because you've realized that not every war is worth fighting, especially the ones that lead nowhere but deeper into someone else's chaos. Silence, in this context, becomes not retreat but sovereignty. It's the decision to no longer bleed energy for the sake of appearing kind. It's the discipline to watch instead of react, to understand before you engage, to choose what deserves your words and what doesn't. And this, Jung believed, was a sign of individuation, the process of becoming whole. Because when you're no longer swayed by the outside, you begin to move from within. You speak less, but what you say carries weight. You show up less, but your absence becomes meaningful. You withdraw, not to punish, but to restore. And what returns from that silence is not the same version of you that left. It's someone clearer, someone less afraid, someone less willing to be bent into shapes for someone else's comfort. So ask yourself not what silence takes from you, but what it gives you. And are you ready to carry that kind of power, even if it costs you the approval of those who only valued your noise? Part 7. The right to not engage. There is a quiet strength in choosing not to engage, not out of fear, not out of defeat, but out of clarity. It's the kind of choice that doesn't scream, doesn't explain, doesn't need validation. It simply stands rooted, firm, untouchable, in a world that rewards immediate responses and equates silence with guilt, saying nothing becomes an act of radical self-respect. Carl Jung believed that individuation, the path to becoming truly whole, requires you to step away from collective noise to reclaim your psychic center. And that often begins with 3 of the hardest words you'll ever say: I don't owe. I don't owe a reply. I don't owe an apology for protecting my energy. I don't owe participation in conversations designed to pull me back into roles I've outgrown. But this is where the discomfort begins. Because when you stop engaging, people panic. Not because you're wrong, but because you're no longer predictable. You've taken back the script. And in Western society, where identity is often built on performance and overexposure, refusing to perform is seen as betrayal. You'll hear things like you've changed, you're cold, you used to care. But listen closely, what they really mean is, you're no longer useful to my emotional script. The truth is, not every invitation to explain yourself is worthy of a response. Not every accusation deserves your energy. Not every story told about you needs to be corrected. Because the moment you feel the compulsion to explain, to soften your truth, to make someone else comfortable with your boundary, you've already left yourself. Silence is not always withdrawal. Sometimes, it is a throne. A place you sit when you've realized your peace is not up for negotiation. Jung taught that the self is not discovered through endless reaction, but through reflection. Through the refusal to be dragged into dramas that cost you more than they give. This is not arrogance. It is alignment. And when you stop engaging, you start choosing. You choose where your attention flows. You choose who has access to your time, your presence, your truth. You choose when to step forward and when to stay completely, gloriously silent. So ask yourself, How much of your suffering has come from the belief that you must explain your existence? And what would happen if, starting today, you simply stopped? Part 8. Sacred Solitude and the Rebirth of Self. Solitude is not the absence of others. It is the presence of yourself. But the modern world rarely tells you this. It tells you that to be alone is to be unwanted, that silence means failure, that distance makes you cold. So you stay entangled, you stay available, you stay exhausted. But Carl Jung offered a different vision. He believed that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, requires sacred isolation, a deliberate step back, not to escape life, but to finally meet it on your own terms. Because only in solitude can you hear the voice beneath the noise. Only in distance can you see who was truly walking with you and who was just following the version of you they needed. The first moments of solitude can feel brutal, like you've lost something precious, like you've failed at connection, like you've gone too far. But slowly, the silence changes. It stops screaming and starts soothing. You no longer check your phone with anxiety. You stop waiting for a reply that never arrives. You stop measuring your worth by how many people need you. And that space, the one that felt so empty, becomes a sanctuary. You begin to see yourself not as broken or insufficient, but as whole, simply because you exist. Western culture often equates solitude with punishment. It glorifies independence in theory, but in practice, punishes those who refuse to play along, who say no, who disappear to rediscover themselves. But solitude is not exile. It is sacred ground. It is where the fractured parts of you begin to speak again. Where you remember dreams long buried under the weight of being too available. Where your nervous system finally exhales. And in that stillness, something returns. A memory of who you were before the world told you who you had to be. A strength that doesn't need validation. A clarity that doesn't need permission. This is the rebirth Jung spoke of, not dramatic. Not loud, but undeniable. You become less reactive, more reflective. Less desperate, more discerning. You stop chasing. You stop performing. You simply are. So now the question turns inward. If you had the courage to remain in this solitude, not as loneliness, but as sacred restoration, what kind of self might finally have room to emerge? Part 9. No longer available, therefore valuable. The moment you stop being available to everyone, something remarkable happens. People begin to see you differently. Not because you've changed in essence, but because you've changed in access. And access, in human psychology, equals power. What is always there becomes background noise. What withdraws becomes a mystery. What was predictable becomes precious the moment it is withheld. You begin to notice that those who once called you too much now crave your attention. Those who once ignored your boundaries now feel the sting of your silence. But here's the truth: they don't miss you. They miss the version of you that was convenient, responsive, eager to please. The version that sacrificed peace for connection, authenticity for approval. Carl Jung understood that the self gains value through integration, not exposure. You are not here to be endlessly consumed. You are here to become whole. And wholeness requires scarcity. It requires boundaries. It requires choosing where, when, and how you show up. In the economy of energy, what is rare becomes sacred. And this is where your unavailability transforms from rebellion to refinement. You are no longer reacting. You are curating. You no longer explain your absence. It explains itself. You don't have to fight for attention. You become the still point others orbit around. But this shift comes with grief. You will lose people. You will outgrow places. You will become a stranger to those who only knew the version of you designed for their comfort. And yet, what you gain is far greater. You gain discernment. You gain peace. You gain a new kind of presence, one that does not shout, does not beg, does not overcompensate. It simply is. In Western society, abundance is mistaken for generosity. But real value is never found in what is endless. It is found in what is chosen. your time, your attention, your care. These are not obligations. They are sacred offerings. And when you stop offering them to just anyone, they begin to mean something. So ask yourself, honestly, if you were no longer available to be used, who would still come close just to know you? And are you ready to let go of the roles that kept you present but never truly seen? Part 10. The journey to become whole. This is where it all begins, not with more effort, more connection, more noise, but with a decision. The quiet, radical decision to choose yourself. Not as an act of rebellion, but as an act of remembrance. You are not here to be endlessly explained, tolerated, or used. You are here to be whole. Carl Jung believed that true transformation begins when we stop chasing reflections and start confronting the source. And the source is within. It's the self that's been buried under years of emotional labor, people-pleasing, self-abandonment. The self that has been whispering beneath every exhausted yes, every forced smile, every unreturned message. I want my life back. And here's the hard truth, getting it back requires losing what was never really yours to begin with. The borrowed roles, the conditional love, the performative friendships, all must fall away. Not because you are bitter, but because you are becoming honest. And honesty has a cost. You will be misunderstood. You will be called distant. You will sit in silence while others write stories about you. But that silence, that is where your soul recalibrates. That is where you begin to live by rhythm, not reaction. By alignment, not obligation. In a society that teaches you to be everything for everyone, choosing to be whole for yourself is the most revolutionary act. You will notice your world shrink, but in the best way. What's left after the withdrawal is not emptiness. It's clarity. You will stop tolerating half-love, transactional intimacy, spiritual laziness. You will stop responding to what doesn't nourish you. And in that space, sacred, deliberate, earned, you will meet yourself again. Not the version trained to serve, but the version born to lead. The one who knows that absence, too, is a form of communication. That silence can hold more truth than explanation. That love, if it requires your self-betrayal, was never love at all. So now, take a breath. You've walked the edges of your old identity. You've sat in the discomfort of being alone, and now you stand on the threshold of something rare: wholeness. Are you ready to live as someone who no longer trades presence for approval? Who no longer makes herself smaller to be accepted? Because if so, you've already begun. And though the path may be quiet, it leads to a life where peace is not just a feeling, but a home. You are not lost. You are returning. And this time, it's to yourself.